And we thank you for everyone who has gathered here to participate and share in today's activities. We pray for the guidance of your Holy Spirit so that each mind and heart will be attuned and that everything planned for the day may be accomplished in your holy name. And so, mighty God, strengthen the confidence of your people, whom you have called to carry out their task for the day, so that they may deliver in a very purposeful and meaningful way. Be with us now, we pray, in and through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Father Carides. It is a wonderful feeling to know that we can all gather here physically again to have heritage programs such as these, seeing that we are coming out of a 2-year pandemic where we could not have programs physically, but we're giving God thanks that we can meet in this fashion today. We are streaming live from the St. Jago Cathedral in Spanish Town, St. Catherine, on our Facebook page at JNHT1 and on our YouTube channel at JNHT Jamaica. You can also follow us on Twitter at JNHT Jamaica and on Instagram at JNHT1. Please visit and like our Facebook page, and if you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button now. At this time of the year, the Jamaica National Heritage Trust would normally have a lengthy month of activities in October, but because of the COVID pandemic, the activities were scaled down, as I had mentioned before. Now there are 2 lectures planned for this month, and I must include that the heritage theme for this month is reigniting, it is reigniting greatness through our heritage. And it is indeed, heritage is something that we have to preserve for a lifetime, for our future generations to enjoy. So this is the first lecture. The second one will be on Tuesday, October 11, 2022, and it will be held at the Institute of Jamaica Auditorium. Mr. Stephen Goldin, he will be the main speaker, and he will be speaking on Marcus Garvey's Kingston experience, his trials and triumphs. At this time, I'm going to invite our Executive Director, Mrs. Michelle Creed-Nelson, to do the welcome and opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Mrs. Creed-Nelson. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Reverend Father Courtney Carides, Assistant Priest, St. Jago Cathedral. Mr. Poinsett, I don't know if Mr. Poinsett is here. Tourism Secretariat. Oh, yes. I didn't realize. Secretariat of the St. Catherine Municipal Corporation. Miss Zainan Parks, is she here? Yes. Curator at the People's Museum of Craft and Technology. Professor James Robertson, our guest speaker. And students, distinguished senior citizens, and other members of the Spanish Town community, as well as our hardworking staff at the JNHT. A warm welcome to everyone this morning. As Ms. Bailey indicated, the theme of Heritage Week is reigniting greatness through heritage. And as a statutory agency of the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport, the Jamaica National Heritage Trust takes seriously its mandate of protecting, promoting, and preserving Jamaica's built and environmental heritage. It is with national pride that we teach of our heritage through public education in this fashion. It is an honor to be having this lecture physically, considering that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic had prevented the JNHT from conducting physical activities for the past 2 years. During that time, we resorted to virtual activities that can be viewed on our YouTube channel. As part of our commitment to heritage education, promotion, protection, and preservation, we are delighted to present to you these 2 lectures on Spanish Town, the former capital of Jamaica. It is important for all to know of the historical value of the monuments, buildings, and landscape of Spanish Town from the time of the Spanish to British reign to present. I am confident that you will be informed, engaged, and edutained from today's presentations on the rich history and heritage of Spanish Town. Once again, a warm welcome, and I implore you to reminisce on the past, preserve the present, embrace your heritage, and pass on your legacy to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mrs. Creed Nelson. Okay, before I invite Reverend Father Cardis to come and bring the remarks on behalf of the Cathedral, I just want to point out that immediately after his remarks, we will go into the first presentation by Mr. Duane Harris. He will present on Spanish Town Heritage District, the center of power in Jamaica from 1534 to 1872. And then after that, we will have the introduction of Professor James Robertson, our main speaker, and that will be done by Mrs. Anne-Marie Howard Brown, our curator at the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. So we will take them in that order. Reverend Cardis, please welcome.
Again, good morning. On behalf of our rector, the Very Reverend Canon Colin Reed, and the St. Jago de la Vega Cathedral Church family, it is our pleasure to host the Jamaica National Heritage Trust Heritage Month lecture here today. It is indeed a memorable occasion for us to have you all here in this space, knowing that this church has a significant place in the built history of our Jamaican heritage. We can boast to say that this church is still standing and going strong for over 308 years now. We're always welcoming to the Jamaica National Heritage Trust and strongly support its mandate to protect national heritage treasures, such as the St. Jago de la Vega Cathedral. This church was declared by the Jamaica National Heritage Trust as a national monument on December 31st, 1992, by virtue of its historic and architectural significance. The church continues to serve in the various communities in and around Spanish Town. Our mission as part of the Anglican Diocese is to promote the good news of the kingdom of God and to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers. Thank you all for being here, and do enjoy the morning's proceeding. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would just like to add to the welcome, a special welcome to my friends, the senior citizens who I had the pleasure of meeting some time ago in Kingston. And of course, the students from Charlie Mount. It is always a pleasure to see students interested in history and those matters, and I'm very happy you're here, and I hope that you will get something from this that will edify you and give you a good understanding of the importance of the capital of this great parish. So I'm very I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please, we're in a church. Please forgive me. I beg your forgiveness. Oh Lord, I'm very, very sorry. Right. As I was saying, I'm very happy to be in this very historic building to do this presentation, and I thank the church for allowing us to use this very important building. In 15, my presentation is Spanish Town Heritage District, the center of colonial power. In 1534, the Spanish settlers established this place, which it called San Jago de la Vega, to be the capital of Jamaica, and it remained so until 1872, which is 150 years ago. Right, so this means that Spanish Town since then has been the center of political power, or all types of power, of colonial power. And dare I say, since colonialism was based on race, we could safely say it was the center of white power in Jamaica. It was a center of religious power, political power. It was the center of political power, economic power, and religious power. So what my presentation will seek to do is to look at some of these important historic or heritage sites that are located within Spanish Town, and see how they relate to the power structure of Jamaica during colonial times. When we speak about heritage districts or historic districts, we're talking about areas, and this is a classification by the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. We're talking about locations where there is a cluster of historic sites. We have a cluster of historic sites that are of important and significant heritage and architectural value. And so we have several of such areas in Jamaica. We have Black River in St. Elizabeth, Titchfield Peninsula in Portland, Falmouth in Trelawney, and of course Port Royal and Spanish Town. And we are here in Spanish Town. My focus will look at the important buildings I will look at in St. Cath in Spanish Town will be the Cathedral, Old King's House, the Rodney Memorial, as well as the House of Assembly. Of course, there are many more, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on these. Since we are in this wonderful chapel, this cathedral, I'll speak about it first. The St. James Cathedral, and this was the center of religious power. Now, I was looking around, and I saw a list of the rectors just to the back, and the first one was listed from 1662, which is very interesting. Now, this spot originally had a chapel that was built by the Spaniards. As we know, the Spaniards were here from 1534 when they came and established the capital here, and they were here up until May 1655 when the British invaded. On this spot, they had a chapel which was called the Chapel of the Red Cross. However, it was destroyed by the invading British, and a new church was built. This one, the Church of England, that we call the Anglican Church today, and it was done in the 1660s, as I indicated. So this building is principally made of brick, and it's done in a nice European style. It's not just a church, it's a cathedral. And a cathedral is a special type of house of worship. They are normally made in the shape of a cross. You'll notice the ceiling is very high, the walls are very thick, and although the design is principally European, it was adapted to local circumstances with large windows that will allow for ventilation in this tropical climate. So, as I indicated, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was very important at the time. And in a sense, just the very presence of the building signified power, the height and everything. It was built in the 1600s, as I indicated, but it was destroyed by a hurricane in 1712 and rebuilt in 1714. And in 1817, it was crowned with a tower and a steeple, right? So as I indicated, this was a very special place of worship, and it signified power, you know, and I found it very interesting that it's located beside the prison, but I will not discuss that today. So the Anglican Church, this church was the main church for the Anglican Church in Jamaica, and it was the church of the privileged people. Many officials, the governors, and many of persons in the army, many of the slave owners worship in this church in particular, and indeed others. And if we look at the several memorials and artifacts on the wall, as well as the floor and even the graveyard outside, we can read about many persons who worshiped there. Many of them slave owners, many of them military persons, families related to colonial administration, and so forth. Now, the Anglican Church was a special church in Jamaica. There was no separation between the church and the state or the government, and that remains the case in the United Kingdom as well. The church had a privileged position. It took precedence over other Christian denominations. It collected a tithe from the government. So when you pay your taxes, whether or not you were a part of the Anglican Church, your money would go towards paying off the clergy, maintenance of church property, its institutions like schools and charitable institutions, etc., etc. It also owned enslaved Africans, and it was a wealthy institution. Now, very interestingly, when we refer to this church, we refer to it as the St. Catherine Parish Church. And indeed, right across Jamaica, there are several churches that are called parish churches. And right now, a parish, when we look at what Jamaica's principal divisions are parishes, and a parish, by definition, is a church district that comes under a priest. No, you know, in other countries, they are divided by states or provinces or boroughs. We are divided by pastoral district. And this is of no coincidence. The early British settlers intended that in each parish there would be a main church that presided over the religious and spiritual affairs of the parishes. Now, in 1870, and I'll say more about this later, in 1870, sorry, Annie, can you operate this on me, please? In 1870, a major change took place, and that was the disestablishment of the Anglican Church. So it was no longer regarded as the official church of the government, right? But interestingly, even though it has been 152 years since, we still refer to them as parish churches. So the point I'm trying to make is that this church was the headquarters of the Anglican Church. It was the seat of the bishop, and it was a very powerful church. This place has been a place of worship, a Christian place of worship from the time of the Spaniards in the 1500s right up until present day today. So we're in a very important historic place. Next we go to King's House. Right, now we refer to it as Old King's House, and this is one of the most iconic ruins located in Spanish Town. Everybody knows what it looks like, and I hope that some of us will have the time to examine it. It's a very, very pleasant looking place. And this was the seat of royal power. It was the residence of the governors, who represented the British government in Jamaica. Now, before 1762, the British governors had no official residence. They lived anywhere they could. Some lived in Port Royal, some lived in Kingston. They rented places in Spanish Town. And the practice that existed in Jamaica was that wherever they lived would be called King's House. But this state of affairs could not be allowed to continue. So eventually it was decided that the governor would have a proper house, and it would be built with such dignity that if the king or queen of England and Jamaica should visit, it would be of such standard that they could house him and host him. So, and it was given the permanent name King's House. Now, let us look at some of the features. It is a classical, what we call a classical Georgian style building. And when we refer to Georgian buildings, architecture, we are talking about places that are built in a particular way between 1714 and 1830. During this time, Britain had a series of kings who were called George first, second, third, fourth, right? So buildings that were made in this time were, we call them Georgian architecture. It had 2 stories, and it was 200 feet long. It is located at the western end of Spanish Town Square, right? And it too, although it was European in style and built with the labor of enslaved Africans, as indeed most of the buildings through the time in Spanish Town at the time, it was built to adapt to the climatic conditions of the Caribbean. So it had high ceilings, thick walls, louvered windows that would allow for ventilation, some type of security, and privacy as well, right? So this was very important. The thick walls were made of brick, and as a matter of fact, some of the stones that were used in its construction were taken from all the way in Hope River in St. Andrew, which I found that to be quite interesting. It had a main entrance of 15 feet wide, and the floor of the porch is of white marble. Now, the ground floor, as I indicated, that 2-story, the ground floor and first floor, it had a major ballroom area, and it was known as the Egyptian Hall or Egypt Hall, and that was where many state functions were held, receptions, meetings, banquets, and so forth. Now, there's a book of a lady who was Maria Nugent, and she was the wife of a governor, and she lived there. And she indicated the grandeur of the place and how a lot of food was being cooked. She had first breakfast, second breakfast, third breakfast to entertain the many important colonial guests who visited the governor and that type of thing. It was the King's House, or as we will call it, Old King's House, also had enslaved Africans, and we are told that in 1803 it had 33 enslaved Africans, and the governor requested 10 more to add to the battalion of Africans who were there who were enslaved. So there was lots of work to be done, cooking, cleaning, all types of things to be done. So as I indicated, Old King's House was the seat of royal power. And this is a very pale look of the interior of Egypt Hall with the columns and the high ceiling and so forth. And this is what it looks like now. And I'll comment more about that. So the governor was the representative of the crown, and he had enormous responsibilities and duties. And right. And of course, ensure that Jamaica remained a place that benefited Britain, because we were a colony of Britain, and colonies were in existence to enrich the mother country, so to speak. So it hosted many receptions of many important persons. Many important persons passed through. One of them was Simon Bolivar, and he was known as the liberator from Venezuela, and several other countries in South America. Also, Captain William Bligh, who was a very famous navigator, he said to have brought the breadfruit to Jamaica in 1793, and I think the Ethiopian apple as well as jackfruit, I am almost sure. And he brought them first to St. Thomas, and this was seen as a big thing, especially the breadfruit. And when he came to Jamaica, he was feted, he was seen as a hero. There's a long story behind that story. But he was brought to Spanish Town and hosted by the governor in Old King's House, and he was given a royal reception. Also, there was the famous Horatio Nelson, a British admiral. These were like celebrities of the day. So, he was a very important figure. And then there was also Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. If you don't know who he is, don't worry. He was installed as the Emperor of Mexico by the French, and he was shot very shortly after. But the point is, on his way from Europe to Mexico, he had to stop in Jamaica and came all the way to Spanish Town to view the sights and all of that. Now, very interestingly, as I indicated, the King's House, Old King's House, was a seat of royal power. And very interestingly, almost all of the governors who came to Jamaica were of very high military rank. They were not priests, they were not engineers, they were not teachers, farmers, or wealthy people. They were all of military rank. And I would say this says something very serious. Very few of them were not of the military, that their presence was here to defend Jamaica against external interests, as well as to defend the interests of those who had power and wealth from people who would want to rise up and take over. For example, enslaved Africans who would be interested in rebelling and trying to get their freedom. So the governor was usually here to maintain power and stability and order in the interests of the British government. Also, our good friend, our national hero, Paul Bogle, in 1865, took it upon himself to walk from Stony Gut all the way to King's House, and he thought he would be able to meet the Governor Eyre, but of course he was turned back. It was not the done thing for governors to meet peasant preachers from some far-flung places like Stony Gut. So he was not given an opportunity to meet the governor. Of course, he never had an appointment. Paul Bogle would not have been able to see the governor. Now, as I indicated, in 1872, Kingston became the capital of Jamaica. So Spanish Town lost its pride of place. And as a result of this, the governor's mansion was moved to St. Andrew. It was moved to St. Andrew to what we now call King's House. And interestingly, what we now call King's House was actually the dwelling place of the Church of England official. Right now, this slide indicates that the Old King's House is of significance to Jamaican history for many reasons, but it was on this place on the port the portico, as it says, that the governor at the time read the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, the Emancipation Proclamation and the freedom that it brought, we can argue is one of the most important events in the history of Jamaica. Right, and of course it was celebrated in Spanish Town Square. Lots of people came out to celebrate this momentous occasion. Right, so as I indicated, King's House is now where the governors started to live after 1872, and they live, well, we no longer call them governors, we call them governors general, and they still reside here, right? So it was transferred. Now, Old King's House, as it now became now Old King's House, it was used to house Jamaica's first university, and this university was called Queen's College, and it didn't last very long. It lasted only 12 months. So, just a trivia question. Jamaica's first university was Queen's College, and it was at Old King's House. And in 1925, tragedy struck, and it was destroyed by what appeared to be electrical fire. And as a result of that, much of it was destroyed. They tried to rebuild it, but it was realized that it wouldn't be practical. And so all that is left is just the facade, the front of the building, and it's braced up to prevent it from being damaged. And as a matter of fact, the decision to do this proved very important, because by 1951, when there was the 51 Hurricane Charlie, 1951, had it not been for these braces, then perhaps we would have lost this very important edifice. And also located on the compound is the museum, People's Museum of Craft and Technology. So that is there today, and visitors may go and see it. All right, so next we go to the Rodney Memorial. The Rodney Memorial is a very important monument in Spanish Town, and I'll spend a little time on it. It's dedicated to the memory of George Rodney, and George Rodney was an admiral in the British Army, and his claim to fame, among other things, was that he defeated a French fleet in 1782 in a battle that was called the Battle of the Saints. Now, the background to this is that Britain was facing a problem with her American colonies. It had some colonies in North America, and they were trying to get independence. And as a matter of fact, they got independence, they won. And the French had helped the Americans to get independence. Now, to press home the advantage, what the French decided to do was to attack places in the Caribbean that were British-owned, and they tried to do that. In Jamaica, there was a real fear among the colonial settlers that the French would invade. And Rodney, who was stationed at Port Royal, took it upon himself not to sit and wait for the French to attack, but he went out with his own fleet and met them at sea. And of course, he was successful. The French fleet was defeated, many persons were killed, and they took many prisoners, and they took the main flagship, which was known as Ville de Paris. My French is not very well, so I'll just call it that for now. Now, Rodney's victory was seen to be very important. It boosted the morale of the British colonials, and it weakened that of the French. And Rodney was hailed as a hero. He was hailed as a hero, and he was feted by the local rulers' elite. As I indicated earlier, he went to King's House, and the governor had a big banquet in his honor. And the politicians, the assembly, we'll speak about later, were so very grateful that they voted a big money for him, £1,000 to make a monument in his honor, right? Interestingly, when Rodney went back to Britain, he was made a baron, and his descendants today still bear the title of being baron, right? And he was the first one, so it was a big thing. Now, in order to make the monument for Rodney, they employed a man named John Bacon. He was like the top sculptor in England at the time, and he was given the task to make the sculpture. And he personally left from England and went to Italy to buy the marble that would be used to make it, all of 204 tons, right? And he went to Italy to buy it. So the statue of Rodney is made from marble, and it is from Italy, right? So now, let us look at some of the features of the statue. Now, Now, at the base of the statue, at the front of it here, is an inscription. It's written in Latin, and it says, if I may translate it, it says to George Bridges Rodney, Baron Rodney, victor in a sea fight on the day before the Ides of April. The Ides of April is the 13th of April, in the year of our Lord, 1872, he restored peace for Britain. The legislature and the people of Jamaica presented this memorial, right? And this memorial to Rodney is presented in an octagonal temple. So it was almost as if Rodney was not a human being. He was given godlike status. And it had circular columns. It has circular columns around it. Now, the first time I saw this, I was wondering why Rodney was in a dress or something that looked like skirt. But I later learned that this was the style that was being used. He was dressed as a Roman emperor in Roman attire, and this was the style at the time. It was felt that, they didn't want to dress them like how they look, but the Europeans were trying to show their link and heritage to the Greek and Roman times. So statues of people who were living in the 1700s were often done in the manner of as if they lived in Roman times. So that is that. Right, so you can see it's a very fine building. Now, to look at some of the features, right, that is the front inscription. All right, to the rear of the statue, we can see to one side of the base of the statue is an image of Britannia. Now, Britannia is the personification of a mythical figure in Britain's culture of a woman who is wearing a helmet, a trident, spear, and a shield, and she's supposed to be what Britain represents, right? So it's a symbol of Britain. So Britain is seen in this. When I took the photograph, the monument was kind of dirty, and my camera wasn't the best. But what it is, it's showing Britain, protecting its colony Jamaica, and it also showed. It also showed it had its foot on a crocodile, as well as another foot on a French flag, and it also bears the head, the shield that Britannia had in her hand, bears the head of George III. So we know that King George III was the reigning monarch in England at the time. And there another inscription has Rodney's coat of arms, and in 1801, the monument was unveiled and it was presented to the people of Spanish Town. And it was the entire thing. Remember, we said it was 1,000 pounds that was voted to make the monument. But the entire thing cost 31,000 pounds. And we can say this is this is a classic case of government overrun. I mean, from 1,000 to 31,000 is quite a bit. No, very interestingly, the Rodney Memorial, it created some controversy when it was to be brought to Jamaica. And it showed the rift or the problems between Kingston and Spanish Town. It was intended to be for Spanish Town and Spanish Town Square where all the important people could see it. But the people in Kingston were saying, no, Kingston is up and coming. It is nearer to the sea, and it's nearer to Port Royal where all the sailors are and those things. It should be in Kingston. And it went back and forth until they had to take a vote. And the vote that was taken was tied. and it was the governor who had to give the deciding vote and decided that it would be in Spanish Town. But Kingston didn't have to worry. Very interestingly, after Kingston became the capital, the statue was moved to Kingston. Yes, it was moved to Kingston, and it was there for a while. And in 1889, after much pleading and lobbying on the part of the people of St. Catherine, it was returned to where it is now. So if that didn't happen, we would have it somewhere downtown looking at. And it's just very interesting. Right, so in 1804, the railings that we now have to enclose it were made by a local firm. Now, Rodney Memorial was a center of attention. It signified Britain's interest in the Caribbean. And some people would wonder, boy, the British defeated the bad French, and that is a good thing. And if the French had defeated Rodney, we probably would be having this discussion in French today, but it was not so. But the truth of the matter is, the British and the French wanted to do the same thing to Jamaica. They wanted to colonize Jamaica and enslave Africans to produce wealth, to make them wealthy, plain and simple. So it would either have been the French or the British. Right, but in this case, the British prevailed, and the monument is a testimony to the fact that the British prevailed, and which of course has impacted on the culture of Jamaica. Now, the Rodney Memorial is a very significant memorial, so much so that in 1953, it has some cannons. The cannons are French inscriptions. Those cannons were taken from the French ships, and they're there. So those are the spoils of war. Now, in 1953, no lesser than Winston Churchill, the famed Prime Minister, statesman of Great Britain, visited Jamaica in January 1953, and among the places he had to see was the Rodney Memorial. And when he came, it was estimated that 5,000 persons came to see him, and there's a huge crowd there. And in the same year, November, the same year of 1953, Queen Elizabeth, on her first visit to Jamaica, also came to the Rodney Memorial. So apparently Spanish Town was very busy that year, right? So as I indicated, the monument is very important, it's very significant, and it speaks about the importance of Spanish Town in the British Empire at the time. Now, finally, we move to the House of Assembly. And this was a seat of local political power. Plain and simply, it was a seat of white male political power, because women were not a part of the political system, neither as voters, neither were they elected. It was way in 1921 that women first were elected, were allowed to vote, and only in 1944 we had our first elected legislature, female legislature. Now, in the House of Assembly, that was the legislature where laws were made, and Jamaica had what we call a representative system, where representatives, I see some people coming in. I'll just allow them to come in for a minute or two, and I'll continue. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll continue as they come in. Welcome. As I was saying, there were representatives, so persons who had property and so forth would elect representatives, and they would make the laws of Jamaica, which were then given final approval by the governor as well as the British government. Right. Now, there was no house for the elected persons to meet. They met several places from the 1600s all over, sometimes in Port Royal, sometimes in Kingston, different buildings in Spanish Town and so forth. And even at one point, they met at my workplace in Kingston, which I'll show you later, right? Now, eventually, a decision was taken to construct a building on the eastern side of Spanish Town Square, which would be where the local politicians would meet. It was also 200 feet long, and it is classical Georgian style, made of brick, 2 stories, and it had louvered windows, high ceilings, arches at the bottom, and it was upstairs that the chamber was where the politicians at the time met. And they had some degree of political power. Now, just to look at some of the major developments, it wasn't until 1780 that some coloreds were allowed the right to vote. And in 1830, all free males, black or white, were allowed to vote, right? As long as you were free, you would be allowed to vote if you paid a certain amount of taxes and if you owned land and that kind of thing. In 1838, we had full slavery coming to an end. And in 1844, George William Gordon, who is now a national hero, was first elected. He was elected to represent the parish of St. Thomas. Now, in those days, it was one person elected from each parish, right? And his father was elected as well, Joseph, and he represented the parish of St. Andrew. In 1847, the first black man to be elected was a man named Edward Vickers, and he was the first person to be elected to the assembly. And guess which parish he represented? He represented the parish of St. Catherine. So St. Catherine elected the first black person to this building, right? After the Morant Bay Rebellion, the assembly decided to vote itself out of existence, and it no longer had elected leaders. We had what we call Crown Colony government. And shortly after, in 1872, when Kingston became the capital, the legislature was transferred to 79 Duke Street, and it was where the laws were made up until 1960. This is where my workplace is. The office of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust is located there now. So what we're saying is that this building was very important, the building there, and from the 1700s up until now, it has been used as a public building. Today, it is the office of the St. Catherine. This says Parish Council, but these days we call it Municipal Corporation. And it's very interesting. From the 1760s, it has been used as a place where elected public officials meet. This is before America became independent. There are not many buildings in the world that have been dedicated to public service like this one. And it is still being used, so it is a very important historic treasure. Now, the time is going. I will conclude by saying that in 1872, Spanish Town ceased to be the capital of Jamaica. There wasn't any fanfare or anything. They just simply transferred everything to Kingston, except for the archives and the records. And since then, Spanish Town has been coming to terms with some of the issues that deal with regarding the loss of its status. The Jamaica National Heritage Trust exists to promote and let Jamaicans, especially young Jamaicans, know about these very important buildings, the role they have played in our society and our history, and how we can protect them so we can have a clear understanding of their importance and value to us as Jamaicans. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that you have learned even one small matter from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Harris, for such an informative presentation. Just want to, at this time, acknowledge the presence of Charlie Mount High School, who came in a short while ago. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Nice to see you. I'm going to invite Mrs. Howard Brown to make her way up to introduce our guest speaker. And I'm asking you if you have any questions, comments, please, we will take those at the end of Professor Robertson's presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all our guests, our guest speaker, the students, members of the Senior Citizen Association, and our executive director. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, a big welcome. I know for 2 years, everything we are seeing or everything we participated in was on the computer, and that is if we had a computer and was computer literate. But thank God we're here today, face to face, to listen to these lectures. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor James Robertson, who I think is a Jamaican by now. Right, Professor? You have been here for about, what, 27 years? Yes. Professor Robertson attained the Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Southampton in 1981, Masters of Arts in 1984, and a PhD in history from the Washington University, St. Louis in 1993. He decided that he was going to leave all of those cold places and come to the warmest place in the world, with lovely people and a lovely history. So he joined the staff of the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in 1995 as a lecturer in the Department of History. He was then promoted in 2005 as senior lecturer, and presently he is now professor, and he is also the head of the History and Archaeology department. So, once Professor had reached here, nobody could stop him. I'm sure Professor knows everywhere in Jamaica, more than, you really don't know, Professor? No, man, we need to go on trip. We need to go on the trip. All right. So Professor has done a lot of research in the history of Jamaica, in urban history, and cultural history. And he has written books that pertain to the stories of communities and the 16th and 17th century history of London. Some of his publications are Gone is the Ancient Glory, Spanish Town, Jamaica, 1534 to 2000, which is published by Ian Randall Publishers, 2005. He's also currently working on a book on the first English century in Jamaica, which is 1650 to 1770. Now, doing all of that work, Professor, you're supposed to have a lot of accolades. So he got a fellowship from a number of fellowships. He received a number of fellowships, which include the Cargrid Fellowship at the National Maritime Museum, the Gilder Lehrman Fellowship at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and he has also received a number of awards, including 2 Mona Researchers Award. He teaches undergraduate courses in imperialism since 1918, urban heritage of Jamaica, continuity and change in early modern Europe, in 1400 to 1789. He also teaches a credit course called History and Heritage, Theory and Application. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I would like you to put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Professor Robertson who will soon be a Jamaican, to come and give us his talk.
I'm tempted to stop now because it's clearly going to be downhill all the way after such a generous introduction. But I fear, as you've invited me out, I'd better say something. I want to start, I think, as a foreigner, by stressing how confusing generations of outsiders have found Spanish Town. It is a Creole town. As Mr. Harris said, it's in a hot place. It uses unfamiliar materials. And so it doesn't look like a town to the people who come from Europe. And they stagger off the ship at the other end. And it's a bit too far to bring so many bricks up, so it's built in wood, and it has thatch roofs or shingles, and it doesn't look like home, and therefore it must be wrong. And we have this time after time. When the first English invaders land, well, they're not the first, they're the ones who don't go away afterwards, in 1655, who land and take Spanish Town, which had been abandoned by the Spanish, they don't understand how it works. The general sets up in what had been the Cabildi, the city hall where the merchants debated, which is over by King's House over there. A month or so later, the Spanish resistance, led by a guy called Yassi, sneaks in after dark and sets light to a house just next door to where the Spanish governor's house had been, to show how far into the town he could get. Afterwards, the English write dispatches and just say, some slaves' houses were burnt down. They don't know where the governor's house was. We don't know either. It was probably in the gardens down there. But there's the incomprehension is a major factor. And so as a foreigner lost in Jamaica, I found using my incomprehension a very useful tool to try and think, what do I need to explain? What can't I understand? And sometimes I'm right, and no doubt often I'm wrong. And as we come back from the 21st century and look at earlier periods, we should take incomprehension as one of the tools we should use to say, what seems so wrong? What seems so surprising? Because there are plenty of wrong things in the past, as there are in the present. And we should get used to looking at the past and trying to see why do they do that way. And then we can judge it, and then we can take those judgment tools back to look at our own society and the society that you will grow up in, and I hope make better. What I'm asked to look at today has been the tenacious glory of Spanish Town. When I was asked to put a title up, it got rather long. And when I was thinking about what to say, I thought I wanted to use the word tenacious, or adjective, because Spanish Town has ups and downs. And of course, the historians always spot the downs, not the ups. Mr. Harris has taken us through several of the up periods, and if you look at Spanish Town Square, it is a magnificent piece of 18th century architecture. What's also surprising is it's one of the very few magnificent pieces of 18th century architecture built anywhere in the English-speaking world in the mid-18th century, because they are at war with France. Even the Treasurer of War in England, who can normally get so many backhanders that he can afford to build really spiffy country houses, even the Treasurer of War isn't building a country house in England in the 1740s. But the Assembly of Jamaica are, because they desperately want to keep Spanish Town as the site for the Assembly, because Spanish Town is the planters' town. Kingston is filled up with merchants. And as the Assembly keeps the same monthly seasons as Parliament in England, which is great for the English agricultural year and is a poor fit for the Jamaican agricultural year, this means that the planter assemblymen all go home in January to do the crop and to look over the sugar crop. But meanwhile, the assembly trundles on until April, because that's when farmers in England go home to worry about crops. That means the assembly, for the time when the final negotiations on the bills are being processed has lots of merchants in it. And the planters are always terrified that the merchants will put the taxes on the plantations. Can you imagine such a horrifying thought? Well, the planters want to put all the taxes on the merchants. And that's why we have Spanish Town as distinct from the main merchant town here in Jamaica. Bridgetown, they're both in together. It's a small enough island that the assemblyman can come back even in the middle of harvest. Jamaica's a bigger island. But what you have is a very splendid square, and that's what survives, that's what the focus of much of the modern discussions of Spanish Town as a heritage city is. It is a magnificent potential World Heritage site, Foursquare. But what I think we then look at is what happens over the next century, 130 years, until the abandonment of Spanish Town in the 1870s, when the assembly is closed down, when the government and the seat of government relocates to Kingston, as Mr. Harris showed us. And what I think we need to see on the one hand is continued building. We get further building, particularly over there, behind the public library. There's more impressive buildings for lodgings. All the people coming in not only to attend the assembly or to visit those parties at King's House, but also to sue your neighbors. People maintain long-term lawsuits. Some of the longest running series at the Jamaica Archives are of the people, oh look, my rival isn't here. Can I try and get in and get my suit in while he's not here? So everybody has to bring all of their witnesses, all of whom get per diems, all of whom need lodgings, and there are lots of lodging houses in Spanish Town. So you have this town with a lot of buildings for the law courts as well as for the assembly. And then when the law courts are closed and the assemblies are closed, it's pretty quiet. It has free people of color, it has enslaved, and it has Jewish merchants. And actually, if you look over to the west side of town, you've got that sort of shopping area over there that's an expansion of the mid-18th century. But what I wanted to also give you is that when the town is abandoned, I was looking at the transition, I was asked to look at the 19th century town. What is the town that the governor walks away from? And the governor is going to say, it's old, he doesn't like it. He is lonely. And in fact, one of his aides wrote a rather smug autobiography saying that they would sit there in King's House and nobody came to visit them. And that's why they wanted to go to Kingston. In part, he didn't invite anybody. In part, there's no assembly anymore, so the planters are no longer in Spanish Town to come and visit the governor. Close down the assembly, lose the center for the island. And in part too, because Governor Eyre, have you all encountered Governor Edward Eyre? I know there's probably a competition for worst, I always think worst governor of Jamaica, Eyre wins at once. But maybe work out who's the second worst governor of Jamaica, and boy is there competition. But Eyre was a snob. He was a rector's younger son who'd not quite finished public school and then went off to the colonies and married a governor's younger daughter. And then is a heroic explorer. Only half his team died. And he uses that as a foundation to become a governor. And Eyre despised many of the people in Spanish Town. He wouldn't hire a local person as his secretary because they weren't gentlemen. He gets a grant from the assembly to buy new furniture. And this is an island that has mahogany. It has craftsmen. He imports the lot from England, and the assembly is furious. Eyre had not made King's House a social center, despite, again, as Mr. Harris demonstrated to us, that super ballroom at the assembly that had been built for socializing. That's what it's for. And then a third description, and there are a set of books, if you look at Jamaican history, one of the things I've found is a sequence of books that are influential. They're the one the visitors read and that shape, and they've got a long voyage by sea coming out. So they read it, and when they come ashore, they are blinkered. They know what they're going to see because they've read a book about Jamaica. And in the mid-19th century, Mr. Anthony Trollope comes out to Jamaica. Anthony Trollope will make a reputation in a little later as a famous novelist. His books are very long, so good for reading on railway journeys. He wrote them on railway journeys. And they write about the nobility and the clergy, so good establishment figures in the fast-changing, economically uncertain world of Victorian England. So there's a changing society, and Mr. Trollope writes about stability. And he also does tours, and he comes out to Jamaica. But the reason he came to Jamaica was not to write a guidebook. He came out as an official from the English Post Office, and he was saying that Jamaica needed to pay more money to the English Post Office. He was about as unpopular as plague. And nobody invites him to dinner. He sits in his lodgings, and nobody wants to talk to the great author, because he isn't that great yet. And they certainly don't want to come to this person who wants to have the taxes raised in an island that's broke. And he comes out to visit the governor. He comes out by train. He's delivered by coach or carriage to King's House. He sees the governor, and then the governor says, "Toodle pip." He is not invited to lunch. And he wanders out of King's House, and he gets lost. And he walks around the streets on a hot day, and he finds pigs sitting in the gutters. At least there weren't a herd of them chasing him. He finds a few lazy dogs, and he gets lost. How do I find a tavern? And then he sees somebody and says, "My good man." And it's somebody who's not white and doesn't really want to be called my good man. I can't imagine why. And give you sixpence. Where is the nearest pub or tavern? And he says, "It's round the corner," and then puts his hand out for the sixpence and takes it. And then Mr. Trollope goes to the tavern and overhears the assemblyman talking about business that he doesn't quite understand. And then he goes back and writes a "We Hate Jamaica" book because the buildings don't look like England. Those red big brick buildings in the square you'll see over there, at this stage, they're whitewashed or yellow-washed, lime-washed. The roofs are not in tile or slate, they're in wooden shingles. The proportions of the houses, which are lower and have big windows, which are often open, are unlike London, which is polluted and the houses are cramped in together. And if it doesn't look like London, and I'm a Londoner, it must be wrong. And so we have this sort of vision from Trollope. And it's on this foundation of two grumpy governors, Mr. Grant and Mr. Trollope, who didn't have any, also Mr. Eyre, who basically chased would-be entertainers, visitors away, and Trollope, who was debt collecting for the post office when he came and was not popular, that we have a vision of Spanish Town as grim and unsuitable, and what we should do is move the capital to Kingston instead, even though even more people die there. So how far, if we step back, and I've just done what historians often do, is here are the sources that disagree with me, let me rubbish them. And I hope I haven't rubbished them too much. But then, let's have a look and see what the buildings say to show us what sort of things are being building. And can we get a different chronology for the understanding of Spanish Town in the 2 generations before the city or the town is abandoned for the relocation to Kingston? And what seems striking is the continued building, and in many ways the continued prosperity of Spanish Town through, or at least in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars, a lot of money is going on taxes and other things. They raise a cavalry regiment, and after it's chewed up in the Second Maroon War, it's sent off to India. But otherwise, there's a degrees of prosperity. Coffee is doing very nicely, thank you, because Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, is not in the coffee exporting business so much. So Jamaican coffee can be exported and do well and have its record year in the year of Waterloo and the next couple of years after that. After that, French coffee begins to come on tap and massive erosion begins to cut down the coffee estates in the Blue Mountains. But in the short term, post-Napoleonic Wars, Jamaica is prospering. And for those of you, I know one school is from Old Harbor. Charlemont is also not a local school, so thank you for being here. But both of you, if you look around the town, and I hope if I don't go on too long, you'll be able to just wander around or be driven around just a bit to look at the buildings that still survive. What you'll see is buildings from the generation after the Napoleonic Wars. The big one is the burnt-out courthouse in Spanish Town Square. That is big and ambitious. Now, unfortunately, they hadn't realized it was, even though it's called White Church Street because that's where the Spanish Abbey was, and beside an abbey you have a graveyard, and graveyards are absolutely terrible as something to put foundations on, so they had to rebuild the foundations for the big courthouse because it was on a graveyard, and that did horrible things for the budget. But they had a big, ambitious courthouse built on the south side of Spanish Town Square in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. You also have a set of buildings. Red Church Street is because the English don't know what this church was called, and it's red brick, so they call it the Red Church. While the one in Spanish Town Square, which is the old abbey, was whitewashed, and that was the White Church. Clear as mud, really. And the brick buildings down there, are many of them are built in the early 19th century because they're lodging houses, or they're where the gentry came, or the plantocracy came, or the merchants came to sue each other or be sued in the law courts every year. And then we also have the railway line. And it's now the railway line, can it be revived? Should it be revived again? Where's it to go? And it's tempting. I will admit I was doing a lecture to my students earlier this week talking about railway lines and talking about the classic vanity railway line of the 1830s in Spain, which went from Madrid to the Summer Palace, which isn't the way you really use as a foundation for an economic boom. This railway line goes from Kingston to Spanish Town, and then they tried to stretch it on up the valley, and then they began to run out of money. And they wanted to go down toward Port Henderson and use it to get the sugar out because the roads are muddy and railways would be more effective. And it didn't quite work. But what's also impressive there is that in the 1830s, where the post-Napoleonic Wars, post-1815 economic slump finally crawls slowly back through the late 20s into the 1830s, and you begin to look like economic prosperity again. And there's money available to be invested. And Jamaica can raise the money to set up a railway line. It's one of the first places this side of the Atlantic that has a railway. And it's also it's funded on the English Stock Exchange. The Colonial Office has kittens afterwards at the thought of colonies raising money on the London Stock Exchange and forbids subsequent colonies doing it. But they were so early that they got in for the money. And by the time in about 1838 that it's finished and going, and it's so successful, people like it, that the clergy, of course, people are missing Sunday service because they want to go and ride on the railway line. So the clergy lobby that the railway mustn't run on Sundays because it's so successful. But then, number one, you have an economic slump and crash in around 1840. And Jamaica gets caught both ways, because the banks that have been founded in Jamaica at emancipation, the Planters Bank and the Colonial Bank, both go bust. The planters who had their money with the sugar brokers back in London Problem. Almost all the sugar brokers in London go bust as well. So suddenly, Jamaica's capital, in terms of cash, has evaporated. And yet, the economy is going into deep trouble. And from the 1830s, there's not so much money to splash about. But that doesn't stop money being spent. You are actually sitting in one of the venues where serious money was spent in mid-19th century Jamaica. This church, when it was built in the 18th century, you can see the white line of the roof line or between the top of the wall and this arched roof. The arched roof is very pretty, it's quite impressive, but the habit of showing the roof beams comes from medieval churches in England because the medieval churches often had carvings and angels and whatnot. This roof was built to have a flat plaster ceiling go straight across. Instead, it was an 18th century preaching shoebox. These pews, which I think were imported, but the older pews were big box pews. You could rent a pew, only not if you weren't white. There's actual complaints that the Methodists are allowing non-white people to rent pews at the front of the church. And then lots of people are going to the Methodist chapel instead of the Anglican chapel. Isn't this unfair competition? Possibly the preaching's better too, to think of it. But what we have is this elaborate church made to look Gothic, look like a proper mid-19th century church. There used to be wooden paneling. You can see roughly how high the paneling went if you look at the 18th century tombstones and assume that the wooden paneling went up to the bottom of those 18th century markers. There's one or two small square ones that I think are later add-ons. So you have mahogany, and there's a diary from someone at King's House saying, oh my goodness, this paneling looks really grim and we don't like it. It's not properly medieval. So you get a new bishop comes down to Jamaica. He'd been at Nova Scotia. He tried to build a new cathedral there, and he comes down here and they're busy building a new cathedral. Actually, to be fair, they'd also built the Trinity Chapel. If when your bus goes off down that way out of town and up towards the ring road, you'll go past the Trinity Chapel that's built as an overflow in the 1830s. But you have a bunch of building going on in Jamaica through to the 1850s. And it's amazing that building is happening in Jamaica in the 1850s because the cholera arrives in Jamaica. And again, I don't know what you get in Jamaican history or the chronology you get at the schools, but the cholera is horrible. Cholera had hit England in 1832, and luckily Jamaica dodged the bullet. In the 1850s, perhaps because laundry is being sent back from California down to Jamaica to be washed, and they've got cholera in California, and whether it's the washerwomen in Port Royal washing it, or however else it's caught, cholera arrives. Now, I don't know, basically, number one, if cholera happens, wash your hands and boil the water, because it travels through the water, you swallow it, and then basically all the liquids in your bodies go, you either vomit it out or it goes out the other end. And it's highly infectious, so if you're using the privy or your privy goes into the river, everyone downstream gets to share it. Spanish Town had a pump down at the bottom, again down by the Trinity Chapel, but it only worked 5 days a week. So on Saturdays and Sundays, everybody gets water from the water cart. And the water cart went down this road, and if you're driving back this way, you can see where there's a lane going down to the river. That's the church ford. And the cart would go into that ford, and at the bleeper's point, they'd fill up the buckets, and then they'd turn around and pull it out again, and then make deliveries. During the cholera, the water company building, the one just beside the ford, is where they put the cholera patients. Now, it's downstream, but it's barely 3 foot downstream. The potential for cross-infection is nightmarish. I'm not sure if per capita cholera had Spanish Town had a higher cholera death rate than Port Royal, where all the water is rowed in, and there were the washerwomen as well. But it has one of the highest death rates. What did I do? One of the highest death rates on the island from cholera. This does not encourage subsequent investment in buildings. Let me see, the country is in a recession, it's had cholera, and the sugar prices in Europe have collapsed. Before the French Revolution, if your ships with sugar from Jamaica or anywhere else the English had stolen come back to England and land the cargoes of sugar, then they will feed the market in England, and the Industrial Revolution, the factory workers, the men are eating stringy beef, the women and children are getting by for their calories on bread and jam. And the jam is done with West Indian sugar. Again, any of you doing nutrition, your nutrition teacher will probably tell you that is not a very healthy diet. But it's probably what got the Industrial Revolution off, given the limited capital and supplies to do it. It's a transfer of resources in terms of food and calories from the West Indies to England to allow the big factory towns to get up and work. But with that sort of industrial base, you can sell as much sugar as you want, and there's a market. If it does glut, you just put the surplus on ships and you take them to Hamburg and you sell it to Germany, and they'll absorb every ounce of sugar you can sell. During the Napoleonic Wars, there's a blockade. The English blockade that. And in that period, the Germans and French invest in sugar beet. It's not so efficient, the sugar doesn't taste as good, but you don't need to get your sugar through a blockade for it. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was, as I mentioned, a short-term boom for sugar coming from the West Indies to England, because people are hungry for it. But even with the factories, there's now, because England has just captured Guyana and other territories in the West Indies with new frontiers and more sugar. So not only is Jamaica still churning the damn stuff out, and Barbados, but now you've got the Leeward Islands and you've got Guyana, all producing sugar by the boatful and no privateers to steal it on the way. And the English market can get glutted. And now they can't sell the surplus to Germany because they've got that boring sugar beet, which is subsidized by the government. And as a result, the price of sugar per pound in London falls. That's what happens with a glutted market. And as I said, there's problems for coffee as well, with erosion and now with competition from the French islands. So Jamaica's revenues are in trouble in the mid-19th century. So again, less building in the capital, even if they build and do up a cathedral and add this extra wing at the end to make it look more church-like. And if you walk around the outside, and my medieval teacher always used to recommend walk around the outside of the church and see the shape of the building before you go in. This bit is basically 18th century. Architectural historians from America get really excited by the drain pipes, which are still the original 18th century fittings. They don't survive like that anywhere else. So that's probably what most 18th century churches, early 19th century churches have. And the windows, these have been changed now with the metal ones, but when you come to this end, they're trying to look medieval. The most medieval thing you've got is actually the brickwork all set up for the extending. This was going to be a much bigger cathedral that went all the way down probably the far side of that square. It would be ginormous. Who would come into it? I'm not quite sure, but it was going to be enormous and big. And they ran out of money. But what you've got is a town that is still building. And it's in that context of ongoing building that the complaints of Governor Grant or of that nobody comes to visit me, it's unsocial, we need to move to Kingston. Or Edward Eyre, who I think if he'd gone to Kingston, people wouldn't like him either. Or of Mr. Trollope, the debt collector from the post office, who people didn't socialize with when he went to Kingston, when he came out to Spanish Town, can be contextualized. And instead, we do get a move to Kingston. And what I think is impressive about this is I was trying to think, okay, and I don't know what exam technique you get or what your teachers tell you, but one of the things I always recommend to people is look at the dates you've got as opening and closing dates, because that's normally what you can try and do something with and disagree with it. No, it's 2 years earlier, or actually, as I'm going to do now, things continue afterwards. And so the transition from Spanish Town as the capital to Kingston as the capital is actually pretty abrupt. There's a notice in the newspaper saying, as of Monday, the mail will not be accepted here and should be sent to Kingston instead. And they just move. The clock from the assembly, which had been closed down by Governor Eyre and is an empty hulk, the clock is taken to the audit office. I do think that shows the changing priorities of government under Governor Grant. And Governor Grant takes over the Bishop's Palace in Kingston. It's now King's House. That was the Bishop's Palace. I think they knocked down the chapel and used the space to make a swimming pool, which seems a new priority. But you have this transition, and there's some poems. My book was Gone is the Ancient Glory, and assorted poets murmuring and woe is us, things have changed, we are living in the time of declension. And there's plenty of that. But how deep is the declension? And at one level, yes, there are major changes. Not, I think, because the governor goes, but because the law courts go. And with the law courts, you lose not only the lawyers, but the plaintiffs, the defendants, and their witnesses. And without all of those people taking lodgings, the price of lodging houses collapses. And there are petitions saying that within a couple of years of the abandonment of Spanish Town by the law courts as well as the others, you're getting, the buildings are being demolished and the brickwork is being reused for building the Rio Cobre Canal to bring navigational water down. Now, that again, one can see as alas and woe. I like the 18th century domestic buildings. They're really impressive architecture. I hope they can be preserved. But the next complaint is not that these are empty, but they're putting up new shacks instead, because the use of Spanish Town is not abandoned. The governor goes, the ragtag and bobtail who follow the governor rush off and yap after him. The lawyers and the people suing each other migrate and sue each other in Kingston. But people still live here. And what you're getting is instead rebuilt for a working class town. With the water coming from the Rio Cobre irrigation, you are getting sugar, and the fairly dry grazing that had been around Spanish Town is instead being repurposed as sugar estates or other pineapples and things. And it also seems to have had some light industry. And so there's actually a lot of wooden houses being put up. And you can see almost like turning on and off a light as the upper class lodgings are knocked down and working class houses, much more closely packed in together, are squeezed in instead. And you get a transformation of Spanish Town. And if you look at it again, you've got a new set of buildings from the late 19th century that I think are fascinating and may well merit preservation, as I tell with an audience from the JNHT in front of me and from the local heritage people. But one that's most impressive is perhaps the Roman Catholic church or chapel over there, which is absolutely gorgeous and tiny in 1870s. It's in what was the builder's yard for the person who did all this woodwork for the cathedral. With the collapse of upper class building, he goes out of business, land prices collapse, and even the Spanish Town Catholic community, who are pretty broke, can buy the land and make a start on it, despite the fact that the senior Jesuit in Kingston doesn't think there's enough money to do it. They gamble it and make it work. And it's gorgeous. And you also, if you move over further west in town, in the 1870s, with Spanish Town as a railway depot as well, you have the market. And the Victorian market, bits of which were pulled down a few years back, but some of which still survive from the 1880s, is really very impressive. And it shows the degree that Spanish Town remains a hub for an increasingly prosperous agricultural district that the Rio Cobre Canal is producing. So, does that? So we have a transition that in 1870 that is abrupt. But it's not the death of the town, it's the transformation. And there we have a set of changes that go through. Maybe the last thing that hits Spanish Town is Hurricane Charlie in the 1950s. It hits Spanish Town. You quite rightly, Mr. Harris pointed out that because of the propping up of the old King's House building, it didn't fall down. But the Methodist Church was knocked down. And the governor, who was Methodist, said, demolish, don't repair. And you can see a lot of people at that juncture were moving from Red Church Street in Spanish Town, and they move to Kingston. Roads are better, you can live in Kingston now. And they're moving up to near that university place. And as a result, a bunch of quite interesting buildings that have survived are abandoned, with the Methodist Church, one of the real foci for new building and new architecture, being demolished and rebuilt in the 1950s. So this red brick architecture has not been, becomes vulnerable at a period when people don't appreciate it. In the 1930s, the governor, who'd never been to Spanish Town, said, oh, it has a square in the middle, rather like one of the more boring squares in London. We don't need to rebuild the King's House after it burnt down. And there have been desperate attempts by a governor's widow to have King's House turned into something else or used for something. And he just thought, oh, Lady Swettenham is causing too much trouble. We have no budget, and it should go on my pet scheme, which is to build a new airport in Kingston. And guess what? It goes bust as well. But what you have is a town that faces challenges, a town that adapts, and a town whose buildings show not a period of solid change or an abrupt abandonment, but a period of ongoing development of successive generations using it and living in it. And the vulnerability of the buildings is not just because the roof is falling in, though it sometimes is, but also because people want the site as well. And that doesn't happen in a dying town. So I give you Spanish Town as a place that's been alive and interesting and offers a fascinating, one of the most fascinating townscapes in Jamaica, as a place for you to come back to wander around and explore, because it's well worth the visit. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. I've sent everyone to sleep, so no one will ask any questions.
Thank you so very much, Professor Robertson. Now, the floor is open. Do you have any questions, any comments for either of our presenters, Professor Robertson or Mr. Harris? Any questions? All right. Can we get a mic to this gentleman, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. This has to do with Mr. Harris's presentation. And the question is, Mr. Harris, is there any history on why the statue of Simon Bolivar was erected in Kingston and not Spanish Town? Mr. Harris.
Mostly because Bolivar is not seen as the great hero until the 20th century, and by then, where foreign governments would donate a statue. And by then, Kingston is the capital. So the Bolivar statue is established there, and Bolivar did live in Kingston as well, so it's not that unrealistic.
I think you asked if why the statue of Bolivar is in Kingston as opposed to here. I don't know, but what I know, in addition to what the professor said, several places in the world, the Venezuelan government has made an effort to invest in Bolivar statues all over the world to promote his memory and his legacy. I don't know why. I cannot remember when it was placed, but I find it very interesting and strategic that it was placed next to National Heroes Park and is facing Jamaica's national heroes. I find that very interesting. But as Professor indicated, Bolivar did spend some time in Jamaica, and his experience in Jamaica is significant to the legacy of Simon Bolivar.
It's in Jamaica that he writes his famous Jamaica letter denouncing slavery in South America. So I can quite see why the Venezuelan government would want it to be commemorated, and perhaps it should be a text that's taught more often in the schools.
Good afternoon. This question is directed to Mr. Robinson. What exactly are the lodging houses, or what is it called today?
They're mostly called ruins today. They may be taverns with rooms over the top, but you may think of them more like bed and breakfast, or the lodgings used for tourists. And in some ways, you have a lodging house tradition in Spanish Town that doesn't revive in the late 19th century when tourism comes back on the north coast and around the banana ports. So they're houses where you might be able to stay for quite a while. When, and I hope it is when, you go on to university, and wherever you may happen to choose, you might think of it like your dorm room at whichever tertiary institution is lucky enough to recruit you. And there, you might have a room and then a common room where you could go down and have dinner, and there's some French descriptions which are really very confused about Jamaican history, which show the French emigres sitting around the table plotting or discussing how the success of Jamaica is really an English commercial plot to do down the French. And I don't think the English were clever enough to have a plot to do down the French. We were just lucky. Does that answer your question or compound the confusion?
Another question, what exists in the square to pay homage to George William Gordon and Paul Bogle, who were hanged in this square?
Gordon was not hanged in this square, he was hanged in Morant Bay Square. And he's hung in the porch of the courthouse, which burnt down just after independence and has burnt down again more recently. But both the rebuilds tend to put back a version of the porch for where Gordon was killed or executed. And roughly the executions for that one were not here. There are plenty of other executions, and I'm not that good at the sites, but I think it's more over to the west, up by the police station, where quite a lot of the executions happen. But I haven't found pictures and locations for executions, so if you find the site, then do put it in the bulletin of the Jamaican Historical Society, because people want to know.
Good afternoon once again.
My question is, does the government has any plan to restore Spanish Town like he's doing with Kingston?
I think it has wonderful plans in its files. I'm not sure it's got a budget to afford them.
Good afternoon. My question is directed to Mr. Robertson. What is a tavern?
A tavern? It's another word for bar. It's a licensed drinking place. It may well offer food as well. So I'm sorry, I've done too much work in the 17th and 18th century and used those terms. Bars nowadays have further overtones of music and whatever. The taverns, the scruffier ones are just sort of drinking dens. The more upscale ones may offer nibblies and conversation as well.
Okay, thank you.
What recommendations would you make to the government to promote an active tourist destination for Spanish Town, knowing its rich history?
Look, a guidebook would help. And actually, what they really need is some taverns and places for people to stop to have lunch when they come to visit. What you've got is a wonderful place for walking tours. And the downside is it's a little hot, and you need a few places at Williamsburg. You can wander around, you can buy a plastic mug that looks like the 18th century, and you wander around, and there are people every 300 yards selling you soft drinks. It's American South. In Jamaica, you have decent beer to sell as well. And that would probably help to get people coming to walk around. That said, again, the Jamaica National Heritage Trust probably has several plans in its files, but as Columbus's secret gold mine remains a secret, we're not able to afford them. But it's the right question to ask, because how do you break the cycle and get people to come to Spanish Town and say, gosh, this is fascinating? And walking tours, but do you put, and the danger is that because the town is still alive, because people still live in it, there's further new building going on as well, and people want the sidewalks for walking on and selling on, rather than to be cluttered up with tourists wandering around with cameras going, look, click, and getting in the way of traffic. So you've got this sort of tensions. How do you show a town that's already alive and is continuing to change, that is a town that has a history that goes back plus or minus to the 1540s?
Hello, good afternoon. I have some questions here. More so for the understanding of our students. There were some terms mentioned. Terms like Victorian, Georgian architecture, the European architecture. Inside the church, Dr. Robertson, you had mentioned about rental of pews, box pews with doors. So if you could just explain for them what a pew is.
Okay, number one, you are sitting in a pew. It's the sort of bench for churches. This is versions done by the Victorians, so they're hard. You'll notice there's cushions on some of the ones up the front. In the 18th century, or actually in the 17th century as well, up at the front, a family could rent a pew and they'd have a sort of box. In England, where it gets cold, I was amazed when I came to Jamaica, and it wasn't cold when you went to church. It's weird. But you have the pews, and they can have cushions. They may have a little seat. Charles II even used to have curtains so people couldn't gawp at him if he fell asleep during the sermon. And a little home from home. But there are rentals, and they cost money. And how far up a pew can you get to rent? That's how churches used to pay for it. But of course, the danger is the family may not come to the pew, And if they don't come, there's empty seats, and where do you put the people at the back? And in here, they used to put the squaddies from the barracks, used to be sitting underneath the organ loft. So you don't have that much space. And in the Methodist Church, there's notes about we're cutting 2 inches off the benches to try and squeeze one more in. So you must have been sort of perched on the edge of your bench before they extend the chapel again. But so pew is a term used in religious architecture or religious furniture as the benches in a church. No doubt you just call them the bench. Georgian architecture is basically classical. It's trying to repeat classical architecture and the simplicity of Roman architecture. And actually, Jamaica is quite central to the development of Neo-Georgian architecture at the end of the 18th century, because one really rich planter goes off to Palmyra in modern Syria, which was a Roman city that had lots of Roman ruins, and he pays for multitudes of drawings, and these are then published. And here's sketches of Palmyra paid for out of the Dawkins estates with the profits. The Dawkins profits pay for this architecture that then fits in and changes the way the architects across much of Europe do classical architecture in the late 18th, early 19th century. Suddenly you're not just using the rather battered ruins from Northern Europe, but you've got these rather elaborate twiddly bits from way out on the Arab-Persian frontier. So you have different type, but Georgian is basically classical, trying to look plain, and probably it's using flat windows with sashes that move up and down. By the 1840s, Jamaicans have begun to use those jalousie box frames, the Guyana box things, out at the front. So that they're and something else that Anthony Trollope would find alien and wrong. Victorian architecture, I wrote a chapter on Victorian architecture, and that was compressed and took 40 pages. But so the quick version is it's reacting against the simplicity of Georgian to do elaboration. In church architecture, they try and do medieval. This end was built just to be fashionable for the 1850s, and then in the 1860s, John Ruskin comes back from Venice and says, no, the architecture we should model is the stuff from Venice. So this becomes old-fashioned as well. But what you've got is neo-medieval, and which bit of medieval, or sometimes neo-Venetian and other styles. And roughly, with more money, with machines to allow you, and railways to allow you to move stone to and fro, with mechanical stone carving tools, you can do a lot more twiddly bits in the Victorian era, and they do. So that's basically it, that in the early 20th century, you get a backlash against Victorian elaboration and back towards a rather more simpler architecture. And then you move, by the 1930s, to sort of graph paper architecture, and that then becomes normative in the 60s, and we're not quite sure what we're doing now. Is that, and most people do that in a term for architectural history.
All right, one final question. This can be both for Dr. Robertson or Mr. Harris. After defeating the French, George Bridges Rodney was made a baron. If you could also explain for them, what are some of the terms? Earl, baron, dame, knight.
Okay, number one, the reason he defeats the French is the French had just defeated the English in North America, and they were about to seize the whole of the English Caribbean. They were joking that there would not be enough sugar for King George to sweeten his tea with, coming from the Caribbean. And then instead, Rodney, using new naval tactics. He smashes the line and breaks up the fleet and sinks quite a lot of it. Defeats the French ship. And so the French win the war supporting the Americans, but they don't get any loot. And in 1789, the French government goes bankrupt and they have a revolution and you have different problems. Rodney does a decisive battle. So that's that bit. Titles. Baron is the bottom rank of noble. I haven't done medieval for far too long, and I tended not to be fussed with the House of Lords. My apologies. My ancestors are merchants, and I looked at urban history. So you move up from Baron to Earl, and then you have Duke. And now they've added more titles since the 17th century that I get lost on. I'm not so good at the modern stuff. So Baron is the very bottom of the noble thresholds, but it does get you in the House of Lords, and that's the big distinction. Does that help? I do have a department meeting to chair in an hour and a half, so I may have to run off. I don't want to leave my junior colleagues.
Good afternoon. I'd like to ask a question. It can be directed to anybody. What are these writings on the floor? Are they actual graves?
Some of them may be, but up here in the chancel, they emptied out the graves, the spaces underneath when they rebuilt under the Victorians. In general, they're probably buried next door, and these are more memorial slabs. So if the last Trump comes in the next 10 minutes, you won't necessarily have somebody jumping out from underneath you.
Good afternoon. It's not really a question, it's a comment. I hope these students appreciate what is happening, because it's just the other day when a bunch of us old teachers or old ladies, we just got the chance to visit the National Heritage in Kingston. We went there, that same gentleman, Mr. Robertson, he walked us through the history, Mr. Harris, the history of the place. And look, when that happened, we are way over 70 and over 60 and over 80. So I hope you realize that children in schools, somebody should make history come more alive for them. I also want to say to Professor Roberts, James Robertson, we have heard your name a long time ago, and you stayed in Kingston. It's the first we are seeing you. Happy to see you. And whatever you said, we didn't fall asleep. But I would like to say, as I am a transfer from Trelawney, come to live in St. Catherine, and when I was teaching at one of the schools in the area, we were told that right under this church, there is a tunnel. There's a tunnel that leads to St. Jago. And that I think it was when the church belonged to the Roman Catholics. The priests used to walk from the church to it was a park. What is the name of
a nunnery?
The place where St. Jago is located.
Those stories in Protestant countries circulate a lot.
It's called Ravensworth, which means it belonged to somebody and they gave it that name. What did you say?
I think there's a lot of stories about that in Protestant countries, because the idea of monks and nuns is and a renunciation that comes with that is amazing and produces lots of cynicism. And so the theme, and equally, Medieval churches did have sewers underneath them. Later generations often didn't. In Jamaica, a set of new sewers are one of the other things that are built in Spanish Town in the 1870s, and then there's another set built in the 1930s. So you do have various tunnels being built, but they're for dirty water. And I love the stories about secret passages. Everybody loves secret passages stories. But I'm afraid I keep thinking they're too good to be true. I would love to be wrong, but I haven't yet found evidence. I found lots of stories, and yes, those of you who, and you're too young to go to taverns yet, but no doubt those are the stories that circulated in the taverns in an earlier generation about those secret tunnels. And they may well be there, but this church, it wasn't an abbey. The abbey is the unfinished ruin up on the north coast. That was the abbot's church. And the abbey in Spanish Town was the white church underneath the law courts. This was the parish church. And it was supposed to be. And so there wouldn't be that sort of tunnel there. You might have drains because we're in a hurricane zone and there's bad weather. But secret passages, that's people's imagination after their third pint of beer. Is that too cynical?
I'm afraid I believe it. I believe it because they told me that sometimes the priests didn't want to be seen walking on the street. So they walk from one church to the other without being seen. So I believe half of it.
Half of it, yes.
Right.
And the other side is you are quite right, because you do have a lot of ceremonial walking from Spanish Town Square out to here. The Freemasons' Hall was sometimes where the governors or the senior people, because English fancy outfits are designed for a country where it's cold and where the main export in the Middle Ages was wool and woolen cloth. So it's heavy and thick. And to march through Spanish Town wearing a thick wool uniform, a wig, and a three-cornered hat sounds absolute misery. So they want to change at the last minute and then parade in their fancy duds into here to impress everybody. So you do have robing rooms and things, but no, the traffic in this town would be more carriages, I think, than secret passages.
Yes, well, I know you're rushing off to a meeting. So it's not a question, but I'd like to mention the ferry, the inn at Ferry, which is what they were calling a pub at the time. And we have the diary of Lady Nugent, was it?
Yes.
So I want the students to remember when they are going to do their research to look for things like that. Lady Nugent stayed at that place in Ferry, which is now a high school.
Indeed, the building you can see when you drive past, though now you can drive past much faster, so you better look fast, just by what used to be the zoo. Lady Nugent's Diary, if your school library has a copy of it, or your parish library has a copy of it, do dip in and read. It is very foreign. The view from the governor's wife's window is a very strange view, but she was there, and she does write quite well. She wrote a second volume when he was senior in India, but we haven't got a reprint of that. Right. And there are very few diaries, alas, from Jamaica. This is one of the few ones that's in print. And it was reprinted by the UE Press 20 years ago when I was new faculty, which probably means there'll be a copy in your parish library. So form a line when you want to get your hands on it.
Mm-hmm. And she was looking out at Tom Kringle's log, which is a cotton tree out there. So they might hear these things. And the iron bridge out there, they said it's the oldest bridge in the whole Caribbean. Okay, but I'm going to let you off the hook.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so very much, Professor Robertson and Mr. Harris. Okay, I have with me Alicia Williams. She is from Old Harbor High School, and she would like to say something to both presenters on behalf of the students who are represented here today, Old Harbor High and Charlie Mount High School.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is not written on any kind of paper, any hand middle or anything as that, but I want to say thank you on the behalf of both schools to both presenters. It was very wonderful being here and learning everything that we have learned today, and we will make use of it in the present future. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And it is indeed our responsibility, not only as the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, with the responsibility to protect, promote, and preserve Jamaica's rich cultural heritage, but also as older folks in the business to pass on the knowledge that we have to these future generations, because you can never tell. They need to know where they're coming from. They need to know why a building exists and the history behind it, the story. Everything has a story to tell. Thank you so very much for that. Okay, at this time, I'm going to invite my colleague, Mrs. Georgia Rookwood. She is the Senior Research Officer at the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, to do the vote of thanks. While she makes her way to the podium, I just want to say that at the end of her vote of thanks, we have some light refreshments that we're going to invite you to delve in at the end. All right, and don't forget to check out the JNHT's set up at the back. There are some interesting publications there for you to enjoy. Mrs. Rookwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to propose this vote of thanks on behalf of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. We are grateful to God for giving us life and for enabling us to travel here safely to gain first-hand knowledge on the history of Spanish Town. A special thank you is extended to our guest speaker, Professor James Robertson, for taking time out of his busy schedule to share with us today on the rise of Jamaica's old capital, Spanish Town's tenacious glory. The presentation was informative and highlighted the transformation of the town and has heightened our awareness of the significance of the old capital. Thanks also to Mr. Duane Harris for his presentation on some of the historic sites within the Heritage District of Spanish Town. This has provided so much value to our audience. To the team at the St. Jago Cathedral, we wholeheartedly thank you for partnering with us on this special occasion and allowing us to host the lecture in this beautiful and historic cathedral. A special thank you to the Reverend Canon Colin Reed, Reverend Courtney Carradise, and Mr. Kerry Francis. To OCM Productions, we are grateful for your continued partnership in assisting us in documenting our heritage for everyone to enjoy and view. We also thank Patsy Lane Caterers for providing refreshments. To our valued audience here and to our online viewers, many thanks for being here with us. We could not have done it without you. Once again, thank you all for attending, and we encourage you to continue to embrace our heritage. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all for coming, and I do hope that we can meet again soon in this fashion. Thank you so very much. Remember, we have some refreshments in the church hall. Thank you.